Good morning and very welcome to the third chapter of this novel, Letting Go, or Nicht, alle Tage in German, as it will appear before Christmas. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel because that helps promoting the novel. And yeah, welcome. Chapter 3 is titled Bruno and Anika. And the first subchapter is called In Paradise. It was the first time they had traveled together to his native place Saarland, which is the western part of Germany next to France. Bruno had raved to her about his childhood paradise, not about the family, but about this extraordinary place on earth where heaven and hell kiss, wine and food come together, where France is no more than a few steps away and grandparents and parents could not only smuggle alcohol and cigarettes or cigars, but even now you can still have an unimaginable selection of cheeses and wines in front of you in just a few minutes at prices that are cheaper than on this side of the border. Plus, delicacies that are not even available in regulated Germany, like frog's legs of various types, colors and sizes, snails, whether live, pickled in garlic or gratinated, at least 15 different types of oysters along the French, Dutch, Danish and English coasts, and even more cheese. He couldn't stop raving about them. Then he talked about the proximity to the river, the Saar, of course, the Blies, the Nahe to the north, which corresponds to the Saarland, and the vineyards in the north of it, the small taverns in a city like Pearl. Anika could hardly imagine this dreamland and was full of anticipation. First, they drove their rental car through Rhineland-Palatinate along the Moselle. Even here, every bend in the road held something unexpected, whether castles on steep ridges that dramatically descended into the Mosel Valley or green meadows along the river. In Bernkastel-Kues, Bruno turned off and followed a small sign with the inscription Cusanusstift. What lay hidden behind there? They came to a medieval building that resembled a monastery. Bruno explained to Anika that it was the oldest, or at least one of the oldest, old people's nursing homes in Germany, founded by Cardinal Nicholas of Kues in the 15th century and run continuously ever since, financed by the vineyards that the cardinal had bequeathed to this institution on his death. And after his last position as bishop in Brixen in northern Italy, he had his heart buried here in the chapel of this retirement monastery. Bruno only revealed the most precious thing about the monastery to her when they were enjoying a cappuccino in the sunshine in the parlor of the old people's monastery. He told her that he had been here once as a student, together with his doctoral supervisor. They had visited the extraordinary library. It was one of the very few private libraries from the 15th century that was almost completely preserved. The cardinal, a lover of manuscripts, had brought it together and left it and the vineyards to the monastery in his will. It's still open to researchers today and provides an insight into the life and thinking of his time. Even Anika's heart began to beat faster as she felt the elation that Bruno radiated. In fact, Anika couldn't have imagined such an elegant library. Wood paneling, large book spines all around, a smell of history and wisdom hovered in the halls, a little dusty and mustiness too. Back in the car, it wasn't long before they reached the River Saar and seemed to be driving from one wonder spot to the next. Bruno explained that they had come to the district of St. Wendel and Saarlouis because of the artificially constructed hills, which were slag heaps, and the tall steel frames that sometimes jutted out next to them were winding towers from the coal mining of the past. Unfortunately, none of the mining areas have been in operation since 2012. However, coal mining in Saarland has a long tradition, including the veneration of Santa Barbara, who people believe protected the comrades in the mines. Anika followed closely, but kept an eye out for the paradise garden that Bruno had announced. Then, as Bruno turned left over a bridge and drove across the River Saar towards, how should one describe it, an ensemble of slag heaps and spoil heaps, her breath caught a little. She thought she could still feel and sense the fine dust particles from the coal on her tongue, in her throat, on her lungs. In the meantime, these artificial stone mountains were overgrown with green hedges and a forest of birch trees. They zigzagged along a narrow road through this cinder forest until they arrived in a small clearing at a lonely house between them, surrounded by birch trees again, and it looked like a fairy tale cottage. "This is where we are," Bruno said proudly, his eyes twinkling. "This is, or was, home." Anika got out of the car and clung to Bruno's neck. "Am I in the middle of your childhood?" "A bit," he said. "I haven't been here for years, so perhaps some things have been transfigured in my memory." "Not at all," Anika jumped to his side. "I had no real idea, but I can see why this place is important to you." Bruno had the key to a house that was apparently unoccupied. But as it turned out inside, it wasn't unkempt. Even though Bruno hadn't been in the house for a long time, it seemed to be well maintained. Bruno later explained to her that his older brother looked after the family estate out of reverence for their parents, who had died years ago. The house served as a place for the brother's children to stay when they visited him, and friends could also spend the night there. Even the fridge was stocked with drinks. They didn't need any food because Bruno had booked a table for them in a French restaurant on the other side of the border for the evening. Of course, he knew the owner and the chef. He had served them dandelion salad with bacon as an appetizer, then vineyard snails roasted in garlic, and finally a bœuf bourguignon on gratin potatoes. With all the aperitifs, wines, and digestives, Anika couldn't quite remember the way home, which led over a small Saar bridge in the car with no sense of borders. The next morning began comfortably. Bruno had not promised too little paradise. The sun shone over the mountains of cinders, and you could get the impression that you had already arrived in the afterlife. Neither of them felt the need for breakfast because of the sumptuous dinner. Bruno drove with Feeny to the Saar, which were the meadows. There, they found a restaurant with sun lounges on the adjacent lawn, where they basked in the sun with a view over the birch forest to the slack. Bruno was dozing in the pleasantly balmy breeze. The past few years had been exhausting for him, but they were nothing like the last few weeks, in which he had to face a new challenge and had thrown himself into it with dedication. Even reaching the end of his university career, which he now knew he had reached, had been no walk in the park. But he was used to fighting his own way, sometimes as an outsider, an onlooker, and not without opposition. He came from a rather traditional and unremarkable Catholic family from this part of the Saarland. There were 51 Catholic pupils in his primary school class, plus only 2 Protestants, for whom there was no separate class, even though at those times there were still segregated schools. One of the 2 was a friend of his, from whom he had learned that there were advantages to being different. He had the impression that the teachers and the principal were more reserved towards his friend because of his denominational affiliation, and that he did not have to take part in the village pastor's religious instruction, but was taught by a young female pastor during this time. His friend was also a rebel, with whom he often showed solidarity, and so they both became leaders in the face of the teaching staff, daring to stand up to the principal even as little pimps. As they roamed the schoolyard, that confirmed to each other with a finger sign that they belonged to each other and could possibly defend themselves against attackers. This certainly had the unpleasant consequence that they received the most reprimands in the class, much to the displeasure of their parents. His worst experiences were without his friend in Catholic religious education. They were taught by the elderly Catholic priest. In his opening lesson for the new school year, it was his turn to explain the basic sacrament of baptism. Father Weiss had been informed by the teacher's room that Bruno was the rebellious Catholic, whose best friend was a Protestant. Presumably for this reason, Father Weiss wanted to set an example and teach the unruly boy a lesson in discipline and order in school and church. "What is baptism?" the priest asked the children, who were dreaming or looking out through the windows. They were woken up by a firm blow with a stick on the first table, and they felt silent, startled and frightened at the stern look of Pastor Weiss, particularly that he gave to those two boys in the front row. No one dared to raise their hand and dared to answer, except Bruno, who sat in the second row, on whom Father Weiss had already cast his challenging eye. "What do you want?" asked Father Weiss. "Why do you already know the answer? I haven't even asked a question yet," mumbled Father Weiss, further unsettling the children. "I have no answer but an urgent request. I have to leave to the bathroom," Bruno crowed, giving the impression that he could no longer contain himself. "You've only just come out of a break," Father Weiss objected, and didn't pay any further attention to Bruno as he set about explaining to the children what baptism was all about. The priest pointed to his cane, which whizzed eerily close to Bruno's head and made his legs shake for a different reason. As in the popular Dumas film of the Three Musketeers, the priest demonstrated the impressively sword-like device, let it fly through the air, caught it again, and struck one of the front tables with it once more, drilling it into the back of a boy and lifting a girl's shirt so that the children expected further attacks. However, the priest continued his catechesis calmly and with relief, as if nothing had happened. By now, his skilled experiential pedagogy had caught everyone's attention. Almost solemnly, he launched into a Sunday sermon. "Well," he said, "the first pupil," and he added with pathos, gesticulating with a cane, "the first pupil was a particularly naughty rascal." The cane fell onto a table again with a loud crack, and this pupil got his pants beaten with his friend. Father Weiss pointed with relish to the cane in his hand and said, "He got his pants beaten." The priest paused, gently stroked the cane again, and added as a punchline, "You know, the nasty rascal was called Peter. That's why the cane became called and named Peter. Peter was the first to receive a beating from this cane, just like you got your name at baptism. Now you understand what baptism is." Slightly sadistic and at the same time relaxed, the priest let his gaze hover over the children's heads and got stuck on the two blonde boys' heads in particular. Bruno, who was black-haired in the second row, was grateful that his name wasn't Peter, and despite being in danger, he had naturally felt addressed in the rascal, sensed from the little grey-head's look that the priest had in for blonde boys in front of him. They actually had even less to laugh about in the coming weeks than he did, while the girls got off rather lightly in class. It was different in the home lessons of the principal, the second man on the teaching staff. He didn't have an eye for boys, but always got excited about the girls' shapelessness, even more so than their obtuseness. He loved to call girls to the blackboard, pull them up by their ears, and push them with their foreheads onto the black chalkboard and shout loudly so that the whole class could learn. Can you read it now? Bang. Do you see it now? Bang again. Do you understand what you see? Again a bang. And with lowered, tear-filled eyes, the humiliated girl dragged herself back to her chair. But there was also a reform teacher who had just arrived at the elementary school with the first graders, as she was proudly and cynically introduced by the principal. She had no real preference or parent preference for male or female gender, but she was beating both equally when they got out of line. This was Bruno's experience in partnership with a female classmate with whom he had been pushing around in the schoolyard, not entirely innocently, he admitted, especially as the female classmate had provoked his intrusiveness, as he explained. They had overheard the bell ringing and had come into the classroom too late. "Where were you?" asked the reform teacher. "We were just practicing a bit of judo," Bruno explained sheepishly next to his distraught-looking girlfriend. "Judo," came back the reform teacher, reached for the wide blackboard ruler, which looked no less dangerous than father's wisest cane, only wider than the loose curtain rod used by most of the other teachers. The reform teacher had the two children line up in front of the first row, bend their heads on the tabletop, while the children at the table pushed their chairs back as a precaution. Zing! And the ruler was already moving towards Bruno's trousers, which the teacher was straining with her other hand, and the girl's bottom. The children, who were spellbound by the spectacle, had admired both heroes, as they told them later, for not trying to deprive the ruler of its best part. Bruno won the double respect of his comrades because they know that hitting his leather trousers hurt even more than hitting her, the lady's woolen skirt. In any case, the children quickly realized what reform pedagogy meant. It was the apparent non-preference for either sex and discriminating punishment nevertheless. In this respect, the Catholic Church seemed revolutionary to them, where girls were punished much more often with harshness, while boys were rewarded with tenderness. Bruno had understood the essence of baptism since the catechism lesson, and later liked to use the example in his lectures to convey to students the sadistic and pedophile pedagogical history of religious instruction, and why many parents refused to send their children to church. Despite the brute declaration of baptism, he otherwise got on well with Father Wise, perhaps because the two blonde boys had his full attention. When he once again had detention after religious education, because he hadn't done his homework or was cheeky, he wasn't alone. One of the two blonde boys also had to stay longer. They had detention much more often than he did. Bruno knew that apart from copying the Lord's Prayer 10 times, he wasn't going to get any more punishments. Peter, the cane, was much more interested in his neighbor, the blonde one, even obsessed with his skin and hair, first snuggled up to his upper legs, then moved with strong movements and power into his lower stomach, pressing his legs against each other, then apart, until the Lord's Prayer lines crossed his lips, and Peter could concentrate on his fingers and hands. As soon as the Our Father had fallen silent again, the fingers had to add 10 Hail Marias. Bruno was usually dismissed from the classroom at the latest at the Hail Mary, because he had served his sentence and prayed his prayers. Peter, however, continued to tamper with the unwilling blonde under the bench. Relieved, Bruno let the door fall into the lock, looked around and peered curiously through the keyhole. Peter was obviously beside himself. He wasn't on his way to the christening, but to get the blonde right. Certainly, Father Wise was what Bruno today would call nasty, choleric, grumpy, sadistic, and pedophile. But Bruno also knew from his parents that they had held the priest in highest esteem, told him that he looked after his flock, watched over them day and night, led a simple life, together with his unmarried sister and housekeeper, and kept the many families who were scattered across the villages together as a community. He had been an institution for over 50 years and had earned the high esteem of the villagers, especially during the war years, due to his resistance to the Nazis, as Bruno's father explained to him when he once again complained to him about the terrible priest. Bruno's parents were conventional, intellectually interested, although not really religious. They went to Mass on Sundays, made pilgrimages to Marienthal with the other families on May weekends and on feast days of Mary, to keep the woe made by the community during the heavy bombardment by the Americans, in the hope of being spared from the hail of bombs on the plea of the Blessed Mother. But there was no grace at home, and the only religious rituals Bruno remembered were that before a new loaf was cut, the bread was marked with a knife in the shape of a cross. And on Wednesdays and Fridays, there were no meat dishes, but pastries. Bruno actually looked forward to these anyway, because he loved his grandmother's sweet preserved fruits, especially the juicy Mirabelle plums that lay in their sugary, gelatinous juice. The only disadvantage was that when you opened a fresh jar, you first had to remove the worms, drowning in sugar from the surface after pulling on the gum. He preferred desserts to plates of meat pie and a mountain of salad. With salad, you always had to bite on grains of sand, and because his mother saved on water, grubs and snails were part of the dish, which, unlike the yellow plums, could not be disposed of carefully. His mother came from an inn, and her father was the son of the only official in the village. Perhaps the family was not even traditional, as both grandfathers were respected men in the small Saarland town, one, as mentioned, an innkeeper. The other lived in a house that even had heavy paintings on the walls and a cuckoo clock from the Black Forest in the dining room. The one placed more value on music and the well-being of his guests than on the commercial side of his inn business, a task that Bruno's maternal grandmother had to perform with her pronounced rationality and a sense of justice. The other grandfather may not have had a high school education, but he could read and write better than most of the men in the village, with the exception of his grandfather, the innkeeper. He later even read Rilke while ploughing and planting with a tractor, while Grandma tried to compensate for the zigzagging of the loads while sitting on the seed trailer to the right and left when inserting the seedlings. Grandpa on his tractor devoured either poetry or his French history books at the steering wheel. The other grandpa didn't read poetry, and certainly not French literature. On the other hand, he knew the government regulations, which predestined him to be appointed the village clerk by the mayor before the so-called seizure of power. He was a born civil servant. That's how Bruno remembered him. Bruno did not forget their Christmas ritual. This grandfather possessed an office in the house, which only he was allowed to enter all year round, and into which Bruno occasionally glanced through the slit in the door. A room that was sterile, the furniture covered with white sheets, so that the protected pieces, which looked like Bedouin tents, would not attract dust. Only the huge secretary stood there tidy and clean. At Christmas, the family was allowed to enter the room. Then the Christmas tree was set up in it. No colorful baubles, only silver ones hung from the dark fire benches, connected with silver garlands. On them, silver candlesticks, and at the top of the tree, a huge silver crown rose between two silver angels. Bruno was most fascinated by the organization of the desk. There was a pencil sharpener screwed to the corner of the desk, a real big thing. It contained a pencil ready sharpened, so that the secretary, as Grandpa was called in the village, was always ready to write. And there were more pencils on the desk, also sharpened as a supply, and all at right angles to the desktop. Grandpa was an honorary civil servant by vocation. Here in the house, lunch was eaten, or rather, when we sat down, at 12 o'clock sharp. Because as soon as the village church bells struck noon, the steaming food was on the table and everyone would have loved to taste a large spoonful of the delicious smelling barley soup. But Grandpa would start, "The angel of the Lord brought the message to Mary," in a reverent voice, to which the whole family would then join in, and she received from the Holy Spirit. Once the grandfather had finished the lengthy prayer, Bruno knew that the first stage on the way to the meal had arrived. This was followed by the Hail Mary, full of grace, before the final hurdle, before the meal began with the common Our Father. Bruno had avoided exposing himself to this game of patience as often as he could, because he couldn't quite control his hunger and felt coerced and tormented by his grandfather. Indeed, at times, the corner of his grandfather's mouth tightened, reminding him of Father Weiss's features when he watched his cane, Peter, deliver the heavenly punishment to the delinquent at the behest of the divine servant. Even the message must have something to do with people's intimacies, Bruno thought. If this angel entered the chamber of a girl who then gave birth, even if Bruno didn't know and understand the details at the time, what was the fruit of her womb that made her blessed among women? And what did blessed mean? When he told his Protestant friend about the domestic torments, the latter countered with different but not less draconian stories. But he kept probing him with a question of why such intimacies played a role at lunch, which their own chaste or even prudish parents didn't even seem to talk about when the children were sent out of the room. Grandfather, the Prussian secretary, had lost his wife to breast cancer at a young age. His eldest son only a few months after her, after he had become badly injured as a fervent Nazi towards the end of the war, and soon died miserably by an additional pulmonary tuberculosis due to his injury. Bruno still had his father's report in his ear, one of the rare occasions when he came out of his shell and told what was moving him inside. His dad carried his older brother, who had been badly wounded in the attack on his anti-aircraft position and had developed tuberculosis without proper treatment. He carried him into the garden every day in the plaster bed to let him experience a little sunshine. But his brother had cried out so heartbreakingly in pain that people in the upper village were still asking what was going on in the secretary's house. It must have been a terrible few months before his father's brother died and Grandpa's second great loss happened. The National Socialists not only brought death and misfortune into this world, They also murdered and broke up families. Bruno had his father in mind again, who had a gaping scar in his lower chin for the rest of his life. It was only as a teenager that he had dared to ask his father for the first time how he had suffered this injury. And it was only when he insisted that his father opened his otherwise usually closed mouth that he replied. His scar, which faded into a smooth surface without the otherwise strong hair growth on his chin, as his father explained to him, was the result of an argument with a brother he had eventually carried to his death in a plaster bed. They were both in the woods at the edge of the village, cutting wood for the family at the beginning of winter, when the conversation turned to the politics of the time, and the brother, who was a National Socialist, began to rant violently against their father, the secretary. He was not a patriot, he thought. He was not devoted to Hitler, and yet he was a civil servant. And although he had become a party member shortly before the war began and under pressure from the government and the mayor, he never greeted Hitler at home with "Heil Hitler," and did not even reply when he himself entered the house to greet Hitler and remind the family of the election that had befallen the people. When his father defended his grandfather to his furious brother and even expressed the opinion that he should not have even joined the party, the two clashed to such an extent in the woods that his brother took out an axe and wanted to execute him with a powerful blow as a traitor to the people. Fortunately, Bruno's father was able to dodge, and the axe only hit the tip of his chin, which immediately snapped off. As his blood rushed over him and his brother, he didn't even have to wrestle the axe out of the perpetrator's hand, for the latter had dropped it in shock, had torn his shirt in two with horrified eyes, and was trying to staunch the flow of blood from his victim's chin wound. Wordlessly, they both hurried home together without daring to say what happened. An accident, the brother stammered. The axe had slipped. And his brother nodded. Grandpa fetched the owner of the village drugstore, who tied the miracles together with sewing thread and a needle after the victim had drunk a strong shot of yellow plum brandy and dabbed the wound with it. The village had stuck together, even through the difficult times at the end of the war. When the Americans had taken the village, and because treacherous defenders of the Volkssturm had inflicted heavy losses on them, they wanted to shoot all the remaining male inhabitants in court, many of them boys barely older than 13 or 14. But the secretary stood in front of the men and all of them who had lined up and explained that no one had acted deliberately, but that everyone had followed the orders of the authorities. The Americans seemed to give in, and after a brief discussion among themselves, they announced that only 1 in 10 of the line of men would be shot on behalf of the others. Once again, however, the secretary stepped up, and out of the line he went and told the American colonel that since he represented the authorities here in the village, he would take sole and personal responsibility for everyone, and that he alone should be executed on behalf of the others, not every 10th. The American was wide-eyed and had the secretary taken away without further consultation. My father told me, said Bruno, that the American staff had been so astonished that they had decided at that very moment not only to let Grandpa live, but also to commission him to track down the last Nazis in the village, hand them over to the Americans as prisoners of war, and organize the transition to democracy among the villagers on their behalf. Bruno had a mixed relationship with his grandfather, the secretary, although he loved both Grandma and Grandpa dearly on his mother's side. Nevertheless, he also appreciated him, And on the one hand, he admired his Prussian nature, but then he remembered another story which his father had once told of a deep sense of guilt towards his own father. The secretary, who had never been in debt in his life, but had always helped out local families who had fallen into debt, for example with food, by arranging help, but also out of his own pocket. He had only deviated from this principle of avoiding debt personally once. It was shortly after the Second World War. Bruno's father had been allowed to take up his studies in classical philology in Lille, France, for which Grandpa had scraped together all the family's resources to give his son, the first student from the village ever to be given the privilege of going to university. This opportunity, which was unimaginable even for Bruno's father. But after this son had been in Lille for a few weeks and months, he had already written to his father to ask whether he would be allowed to travel by train from Lille back to the Saarland for the village fair, and then return to his place of study. He immediately received a short letter back from his father, which contained the return ticket for the train journey. It was only years later that his own father learned from his stepmother that it was the first and only time in his life that he had taken out a loan from the Raiffeisen Bank in the village and had only paid off the cost of the journey of his son in 2 monthly installments. Bruno's father had, as he said, never been feeling so miserable when his stepmother told him this that he was almost heartbroken and would have preferred to make amends to his father. But Bruno's stepmother, who explained this background to him, told him that he must not mention the incident to his father under any circumstances. She had promised him strict silence. At the time, Bruno's father had resolved to at least tell his future children what he was not allowed to say to his father and what he was not allowed to apologize to him for, in order to explain his own stupidity to them and to illustrate the love and generosity of his otherwise buttoned-up grandfather. Precisely because he knew that Bruno often didn't understand his grandfather and sometimes even smiled at him when he explained to his grandchildren his old age, still wearing a starched white shirt and black sleeve protectors, how they should put the wood in the stove and scrape the weeds out of the cracks in the driveway. It was important for Bruno's father to gain understanding for his own father from his children. Although they earned a few pennies for these tasks, which were reminiscent of a household with lowly employees and even a silver 50 on funfair days, not to mention the 100-mark bills ironed completely smooth by Grandpa himself, which every grandchild in the family received at Christmas in white envelope with a handwritten name. Grandpa had remarried in order to support the family after his wife's early death from cancer. And Bruno liked his step-grandmother, especially because she had a moderating influence on her often strict husband, whom she served and for whom she made an effort into old age. She was the one who kept the family together around Grandpa, even when this increasingly demented old man threatened to tear the family apart. Coming from a village in elementary school, from which only 3 children in his year went on to a secondary school in St. Wendel, and graduating from a grammar school there was not an easy start for an interested person like Bruno. His parents had certainly supported him, as had his siblings. But when he arrived at the old grammar school for the 10-year graduation ceremony, it turned out that of the 25 graduates in this year, only one other classmate had ever left the Saarland to study or work. He knew the people from the Saarland were down to earth, but the fact that this one friend had only just made it to Frankfurt because of his job alienated Bruno. He himself would have loved to go to the German-French grammar school in the state capital after finishing his elementary school in the village, especially as his father could have taken him to school by car, as he worked in the university library in Saarbrücken. So it wasn't a journey by bus or train. The few times his father was away on business and he would have had to take public transport, that would have spoken against the school in Saarbrücken in terms of money or time. The biggest obstacle was his mother's fear of letting her youngest son go to the school in the big city. All of Bruno's efforts had failed, and his father had ultimately had to agree with his wife, so the parents opted for Saarlouis as the school location. The teachers there came from just around the corner, so they were more interested in anything but schooling. Bruno complied, even though he mourned the other school of the whole of his secondary school life. Although he had integrated himself into the class community and found a loyal friend in Annette, at whose side he sat in class for years, who soon knitted him a sweater, and under whose sweater he was able to discover the joys of puberty, the school remained foreign to him until his A-levels. When Bruno had almost finished his studies, that he found out that some of his fellow students had been sponsored by the German National Academic Foundation, which was usually recommended by the school. However, there was never any talk of such funding opportunities at his school. He said goodbye to the school at an early age and set up his own business, at least mentally. He was barely 11 years old when he seized the opportunity to visit his aunt, who was married to a man from Burgundy in Alsace, to get to know her neighboring family and become friends with their eldest son, Pierre. This initial pen friendship developed in such a close family relationship that Bruno spent Easter and summer vacations with a French family from the following year onwards, spending Easter in Alsace and the summer with a family in their original home, Saint-Brieuc in Brittany. In this roundabout year and way, he had acquired French as his mother tongue, and also opened up a world of French culture, food, and drink with a cosmopolitanism that made his native village life seem all the more foreign to him. Above all, he spent weeks at a time in the stately house in the center of Saint-Brieuc. His aunt, who played table tennis with him in the cellar in the morning, led to a real workout because she herself played table tennis in the French national team. The daily visits to the market with the women of the extended family was amazing. They came to townhouse in the summer from the most diverse regions of France, Alsace, Burgundy, Paris, and southern Brittany. At these markets, there were vegetables that Bruno knew neither from home nor from books. Next to the vegetables were the seafood traders, a world that had previously been completely unknown to him. He definitely wanted to try everything, and yet his curiosity was occasionally curbed at the table, partly because his language skills were still more than poor at first, as he could do little with the French he brought with from his secondary school. One of his first evenings in Saint-Brieuc began with nuts, small pastries, tiny quartered beets, which he had previously only known warm and as cooked vegetables. But here it were in balsamic sauce with various aperitifs. At the age of 12, he was given a Pernod, albeit very diluted, and later at dinner, the alcoholized cider made by Pierre's grandfather. But when the first starter was served, a large platter of giant mussels, which Bruno had never seen before and which were obviously not even cooked, he experienced his first embarrassment, only made more bearable by the light fog of alcohol that had risen into his head. Pierre's mom tried to explain to him with hands and lemons how he could eat oysters. She squeezed half a lemon over the mussel and took the small champagne glass that was given to everyone, even the older children like him, to let the mussel meat float in the shell. Then she put the mussels to her lip and slurped it down with a sound of pleasure. Bruno had to stop himself. Instead of pleasure, the hairs on his skin stood up. Probably because he had gone pale, Pierre's grandmother handed him a plate with only 3 of these monstrosities on it with a sympathetic look, and everyone sitting around the table stared at this plate, full of anticipation as to how the delicious starter would taste to the boy from the Saarland. Bruno summoned up all his courage and handled the first oyster according to the slurping ritual that Mary had demonstrated to him. As soon as it tingled on his tongue, however, he felt nothing but a gelatinous something that triggered a nauseating sensation, both of which were overlaid by the tangy alcoholic beverage. The whole family clapped and rejoiced with him because he must have looked visibly happy, even if Bruno thought his French host must have misunderstood his cheerful expression. While he was happy to have survived the first of the 3 tests of courage, they probably thought they had hit his French border tastes with this delicacy. Bruno knew he couldn't leave the other 2 oysters on his plate without deeply offending the family. So he pulled himself together again and reached for the second, and following the same ritual, the 3rd oyster. Pierre's grandpa, a little man who always walked around from morning to night wearing a blue checkered work apron and boots, and his Breton cap, and several times a day turned all the cider bottles in the cellar a few degrees, one by one, which was his main occupation in retirement. This grandfather jumped up with joy and talked at Bruno without Bruno understanding the Breton-tinged words. Mary sensed Bruno's helplessness and tried to interpret the half-Breton through slow, articulate French. Bruno still knew what a hopeless situation he was in. He scratched together the vocabulary in his memory and tried to remember the rest of the grammar, but he neither knew what Grandpa had wanted to tell him nor what his interpreter was trying to make clear to him. As he wanted to be diplomatically and polite, he replied with a nod. And when this was positively received with a short "oui, oui," whereupon the family's delight was reawakened, and everyone seemed to congratulate each other. The champagne glass was raised to him, and Grandpa had the privilege of proudly presenting him with a full plate of oysters. Bruno had arrived in the French family. Not all unfamiliar dishes needed to overcome such initial thresholds. The bitter-sweet artichokes, which were more of a family treat than a satisfying snack, had even tasted reasonably good to him from the start. The brownish sea sponges, which Bruno had previously only known as a yellow cleaning agent from his Saarland bathtub and from his mother's kitchen, took longer to get used to, but which you could obviously not only press onto your skin and use to clean ovens, tables, and toilets, but also fill your mouth with, even if this involved some self-conquest. He had just approached the sponges tactically when he experienced a new surprise in his mouth, because here they were completely unexpectedly slimy and sleamy. Bruno could no longer remember what they tasted like, if they had any particular taste at all. His impression that these sponges tasted like spruce bathwater overrode any culinary past. However, there were also challenges at the table that seemed almost impossible to overcome, even with the greatest curiosity and his usual recklessness, such as a bowl full of small black eggs, which he later identified as sea snails in the dictionary, and which, even uncooked, were still enjoying life in front of him, cheerfully and cheekily showing and stretching out their innards, then cutely pulling themselves back together and into the snail shell. But he had to pick them open at the tip of the inside with a small needle that each participant at the table had received. Before devouring these popular table appetizers, they had to be freed from their small, hard, and inedible protective shell, a procedure that the snail that had just been seized obviously disliked very much, which is why it writhed one last time before disappearing into the maw of the hungry. Other culinary specialities were a delight, but required extraordinary skill in the kitchen and at the table, which Bruno was completely unfamiliar with and which later made him laugh when he saw such a scene captured in a film by the English comedian Rowan Atkinson. It started with the unpacking of the bags brought from the market. Bruno reached into the one that was given to him, the evening's king dish. Already with a sensible certain caution, he only pulled his hand out again immediately, because a pair of hair and thorn-covered grab tongs was still reaching after him. Mary watched him and grabbed it bravely, and with her usual skill, before Bruno had got over his fright, the crab, which was more than the size of a hand, had disappeared in the oversized pot of boiling salt water. Well, thought Bruno, I'd better leave these bags to the insiders and pass them on to Mary. But the second bag, which, as it turned out later, contained the appetizer, turned out to be no less dangerous. Based on his experience with the first bag, Bruno initially opened it just a crack and peered inside. The contents resembled a lumpy little porcupine. But after he had also passed the bag on, the pile, which Mary had skillfully disentangled with leather gloves, unraveled an abundance of small and medium-sized sea urchins on a tray, which immediately disappeared into one of the huge fridges. How was it possible to eat such spiny creatures? Bruno puzzled. Another demonstration in the evening was to solve the riddle, and Bruno had to pass another test of courage, which turned out to be twofold. Firstly, holding the sea urchin correctly by cutting it inside and out. And secondly, enjoying this initially repulsive seafood. Not one evening in the 6 summer weeks went by without another of these culinary surprises. Be it horse or veal, eggs of various sizes, cheese variations that were blue in color as if they had been rotting in the Saarland cellar for months, green and yellow, red and grey, with smells that Bruno could only slowly get used to. Certainly, this was not how he had imagined the German-French grammar school to be, and he often had to think about his mother's fears and found himself secretly sympathizing with her and apologizing to her. Here and there, he suspected what his mother might have wanted to protect him for. The very next morning, after the oyster battle, he had fallen into another language trap. Because when Mary met him in the kitchen while the women were already busily cleaning and washing the vegetables for the evening and turning them into another giant pot of soup for the evening, while everyone helped themselves to the white bread on the table with butter and jam, there didn't seem to be breakfast table like at home in his country. He was asked something in French, which, as it turned out afterwards, must have been something like, "Bruno, did you sleep well?" Mary made an effort to speak to him a little more slowly than the rest of the family, who always included Bruno in the fireworks of conversation. This time he thought he had heard the word moule, and the giant plate of oysters from the previous evening, which he had eaten down to a small amount, immediately appeared in front of him. Fearing that he was about to be served what was left for breakfast, he replied in horror, "No, no," which caused a massive upset among the ladies standing around and worrying for Bruno why he couldn't sleep. Somehow Bruno realized that there seemed to be another misunderstanding, because despite the surprising food, the alcohol, which he was otherwise unaccustomed to, had probably helped him sleep through the night like a little sack. Nevertheless, Bruno grew with these and other challenges. Over time, he no longer only began to have nightmares at night about dreadful evening meals that tasted better and better week after week, but he also found that people and animals in his dreams began to talk to him in French. using words that, when he woke up, still seemed completely foreign and incomprehensible to him. He himself had the feeling that he had gradually grown into the new family, and with it into a country that was becoming more and more familiar to him. But the distance he felt to his Saarland village and the grammar school was increasing with every measure and every meal. He noticed this distance the most when he trotted back to his class at the beginning of the new school year, after these long stays, and when he had to learn a language in his French lessons that was very different from the one he had been talking in for the past few weeks, and in which he had been dreaming for a long time, even back in the Saarland. Surprisingly, he no longer needed to learn grammatical formulas, neither for speaking nor for writing, and most of the vocabulary came naturally to him. He did not manage to get good grades, however, in his French tests, because he was asked to determine forms and to know why this or that grammatical phrase should be used in this or that way. With French, German was not difficult for him either. But here he ran into another wall with his German teacher. He pored over Goethe's Faust for a whole year and demanded tick box classwork. Bruno was terribly bored, especially as he had started writing poems and short stories from the age of 13, which he first shared with his family and then with like-minded people. At some point, he decided to become a writer and set about getting his poems and short texts published. He obtained reference works on literary journals from the university library, remembered the Horen, made a long list of postal addresses, copied some of his texts, and sent them to over 100 addresses. To his surprise, there were even some replies. Usually, there were standard letters rejecting his texts. But he also remembered the day when, instead of one of the usual rejection letters, he found a large envelope in his letterbox with a reference copy and a stamp on it. Full of anticipation, he opened the parcel and found 2 copies of a small hand-printed prison magazine produced by the inmates for their own use, accompanied by a short letter of thanks. Bruno couldn't have been prouder. Like a message in a bottle, his poem had found its way into a foreign world and met with their interest. And was not to remain the only positive response. Bruno was soon attending regional and national readings and lectures, and at 16 became the youngest member of a free writers association in the Saarland, to which he either rode his innkeeper grandfather's moped, or to which his father brought him and picked him up again late at night. At these meetings, which took place in the house of the association's founding family, and were between 10 and 15, mostly elderly ladies and gentlemen, they always came together to read their text to each other and plan their regular joint publication. Bruno quickly learned that the position of writers was precarious. Much more powerful were editors, publishers, trade fair organizers, and marketeers, without whom the author's results would be silenced, condemned to be read at home. In short, Bruno decided to rather become a publisher and an author in addition. He founded a small publishing house, the Edition Aurelius, where his first product was a volume of his own poetry. It was produced in the university's library's copy shop, which also took on external orders, and where Bruno was employed as a temporary worker, on the one hand to earn money, on the other to learn how to print, hot glue, bind, and register biographical products, and at the same time to have the opportunity to post his own works on site. When he passed on and sold his volume of poetry from this Edition Aurelius, it sounded very different from when colleagues or writers circled their own products as self-published ones. At the same time, Bruno thought he still had to learn how to expand the publishing business. This was his chance in nearby Trier. At a reading of writers, he met a director of an alternative publishing house who was just a few years older than him and with whom he soon became friends. He agreed that his own small Edition Aurelius would be allowed to sail as a branch of the Trier publishing house, which was better known among the various alternative publishers that emerged at the time in Germany, even if both publishing houses retained independent accounting. Together with his Trier publishing house, the Edition also took off. Bruno was able to acquire novels, short stories, and volumes of poetry from considerably older colleagues, print them, and include them in his publishing program. And one of the highlights of this student publishing activity was his co-planning and co-preparation of the so-called alternative Frankfurt Book Fair. This was because the younger generation of authors had become aware that they should not, like many older, often self-pitying poets, reach out to the few established publication organs and publishing houses, but that they had to confront these publishing houses, which were geared towards market share and sales and met every year at the famous Frankfurt Book Fair. So they wanted to place their own products as avant-gardists to an alternative book fair. Another attempt to wriggle out of the village confines of the Saarland was his idea, inspired by his literary and political activities, to enter local politics. As he wanted to show that political parties in the village also needed a youth section, he won over a school friend of the same age, with whom he had obtained the agreement of the left-wing party leadership. In return, his friend persuaded him to join the Catholic youth work. After just a few weeks, however, it became clear that the party members were so state-obdurate, traditional, and inflexible that youthful politics was hardly possible with them. In addition, it was precisely at this time that the Americans wanted to build an AWACS, early warning airport, near the village to shape their deterrence policy towards the Eastern Bloc, which the party leadership saw as a good opportunity to create jobs. But the youth organization, led by Bruno, saw as a betrayal of the party's pacifist goals and a disfigurement of the attractive Saarland landscape. The political situation within Catholic youth work was quite different. Here, Bruno encountered political support in the fight against the AWACS planning and all levels that were accessible to him, right up to the diocesan leadership of the youth organization, as well as a commitment to other issues. Only here, for example, did he find clear language for the outlawing of South Africa's apartheid policy and a rethinking of environmental issues. Bruno had obtained the oil atlas from Shell, free of charge, which the company had made available to him for youth work. Because since the oil crisis of the early 70s, it had been understood that alternatives had to be sought. In this environment, like-minded young people, group leaders, as well as clergymen were also found, who further developed the political program in joint events and conferences and carried out street demonstrations and political actions. Bruno felt more and more at home in this environment and less in a party political context. Above all, because he was able to combine his literary production with active politics in the church's youth work. School remained a minor matter, the village too, even the family at home. Another of his attempts to free himself from this confinement had also failed. He had been given the opportunity to spend a year at school abroad in the USA, but he had fallen at the same hurdle as before: his mother's almost hysterical fear of losing her son for a year, and his father's support for her. As a result, he immersed himself even more in church and political youth work and expanded his literary activities. In order to become independent of school, he enrolled in a college literature that was run on the broadcast. Graduating with an A of this college would give him the vocational baccalaureate, an A level, and thus the opportunity to start a relevant course at the university. Although he wanted to do his A levels, it reassured him that he at least had the entry requirements for a course of study that he would enjoy. And the fact that he had this qualification in his pocket inspired him even more to pursue his hobbies instead of preparing for his A levels. The fact that he managed to pass his A levels with a reasonably acceptable average in the end was less down to him or his teachers than to the fact that it was obvious that many of his fellow A-level students in this year group, and indeed nationwide, were considerably worse than him and did less well. Even in the year before graduating from high school, it had become clear to him that the combination of his political and literary interests was better suited to the Catholic Church than the often populist, voter-oriented literary world and the business-oriented literary world. However, it was also clear to him that he could only have a significant influence within the church if he took on the position of a clergyman. He had often experienced that lay people were deprived of important decisions, an attitude that had begun to change with the recent Second Vatican Council, but which could only be proactively and radically changed by the clergy themselves. Just as many active members of the student revolt had taken the path through the institutions and, in Bruno's opinion, had also had some successes, it also seemed to him necessary and possible to bring about cultural and political change within this worldwide organization. The written A-level was spread over 10 days. It started with the exams in German and Latin. Then came the weekend before math and French had to be written. Bruno had borrowed a friend's father's transferable first-class German railway travel pass to help him with his plans for the future. Instead of making final preparations for the A-levels in mathematics and French, Bruno got on the train and traveled to various university cities and to see the places, to meet students of philosophy, theology, and history, and ask them about their experiences. He stopped off in Trier, Mainz, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Munich. Trier seemed too close to him. Munich too cosmopolitan. After all, despite the Bavarian environment of the CSU, it was a city that had been governed by the socialists. Mainz was terribly conservative. There, it seemed to him, scholasticism had survived the Second Vatican Council. Frankfurt looked philosophically interesting, but cerebral and far removed from the problems of the present. Hamburg would have appealed to him as a city, but Catholic theology had little ecumenical orientation there, whereas in the capital of Bavaria and Munich, he did not encounter this type of traditionalism. The church, right up to the faculty, seemed to want to lead the uprising of radical thinking against the establishment. Even in the so-called seminary in Munich, things were more open than in the city and state students' residences, and there were still rooms available. So soon after the A-levels, he had voluntarily waived the oral exam. And instead, he went to pass a trip to the south. He booked himself with so-called Rotel tours. It was one of the few companies with which you could travel to Syria, Iraq, and Kuwait, countries that interested Bruno because of his interest in history, culture, and politics. Armed with a bucket, the feature which you could already spot on the train, there were travelers with Rotel tours, he set off, and in Passau, where he started, Bruno discovered that as an 18-year-old, he was the youngest traveler in the group by at least about 40 years. After just a few days traveling through Austria, the former Yugoslavia, and Greece, the tour group reached Istanbul. And the tour guide, who usually led the group through Turkey, Kurdistan, Syria, Palmyra, Mesopotamia, in Iraq, and the desert of Kuwait, joined there. Bruno quickly became close friends with him and learned how to lead a group as a tour guide. how to get on with the bus driver, and how to earn money in all sorts of places during the trip. As he got to know the Arab and pre-Arab culture and places of worship, which made a huge impression on him, he also enjoyed the local cuisine and hospitality. Having returned home with a wealth of experience, Bruno wanted to become financially independent of his parents, who were rather skeptical about his decision to study theology, religion at the university. In addition to his work as a lecturer, following this Funkkolleg, this college on the broadcast, which happened, the next one, to be on religion, he was offered the opportunity to take up a student assistant position at the university in Munich, in the very department that interested him the most, namely philosophical ethics. It was held by a younger professor, the first layman to hold such a position, which was otherwise only held by clergymen in Catholic faculties. This professor had his own family with 2 children and was a specialist in medical ethics and globalization issues. From the outset, Bruno felt that he could not have met a better mentor. He soon took him and his circle of friends to his heart and supported them. The end of the first chapter, subchapter of chapter 3. Thank you very much for listening in, and expect a bit of more about Bruno, and next time more about Anika. Thank you.